The silver-plated wagon wheel cracked against the rocky ground with a sound that made every head in Copper Creek's Main Street turn. Evangeline Hawthorne stepped down from her pristine carriage, her emerald silk dress catching the afternoon sun like fire, and surveyed the damage with the kind of disdain reserved for stepping in manure. $20 to whoever fixes this contraption, she announced, her voice carrying the authority of old money and new arrogance. The crowd that had gathered began to murmur. $20 was more than most folks saw in 2 months. I doubt any of you backwater simpletons could manage such delicate work. From the shade of Murphy's General Store, Caspian Wild watched the spectacle unfold. His weathered hands, stained with honest dirt and calloused from years of ranch work, absently stroked the neck of his bay mare. He'd ridden into town for supplies, not entertainment, but something about the woman's cutting tone made his jaw clench. Of fact, Evangeline continued, pulling off her kid leather gloves with theatrical flair, I'll make it interesting. Fix my wagon properly, not some ham-fisted patch jaband. I'll give you the whole thing. Worth more than this entire Dusty. Excuse for a town? Laughter rippled through the crowd, but it held an edge of bitter truth. The Hawthorne family owned half the territory, including the railroad rights that could make or break every business on Main Street. Her father had built an empire on the backs of men like those now shuffling their feet in the dust, too proud to grovel, but too desperate to walk away. Old Pete the blacksmith stepped forward first, its massive frame casting a shadow across the broken wheel. I'll give it a try, Miss Hawthorne. But as he knelt to examine the damage, his confident expression crumbled. The wheel wasn't just cracked, the entire axle assembly had shifted. The metal fittings were bent beyond simple repair, and the brake mechanism had been twisted into an impossible knot of steel and leather. Well, Evangeline tapped her foot, impatiently. I haven't got all day. Pete wiped sweat from his brow despite the cool air. Miss, this here's gonna need, well, it's gonna need a miracle worker. The whole suspension's shot to hell begging your pardon and these fancy foreign parts. ... double quotes. He shook his head. I ain't never seen craftsmanship like this. 3 more men tried their luck. The town's carpenter, who declared the wooden components beyond salvation. The preacher's son, who fancied himself handy with tools, gave up after 10 minutes of futile struggle. Even Marcus Finn, who'd built half the houses in Copper Creek with his own 2 hands, admitted defeat. Evangeline's smile grew sharper with each failure. Perhaps I overestimated the ... capabilities ... Oh, Copper Creek's finest. She began pulling her gloves back on. I suppose I'll have to send to San Francisco for a proper craftsman. That's when Caspian pushed away from the storefront post and walked forward, his spurs jingling softly against the packed earth. The crowd parted for him, and Evangeline's green eyes narrowed as she took in his appearance-torn denim, faded flannel shirt, and boots that had seen more miles than most men saw in a lifetime. You've got to be joking, she said. Caspian touched the brim of his hat politely. Ma'am. He crouched beside the wagon, his hands moving over the damage with surprising gentleness. Mind if I take a look? Evangeline's laugh was sharp as crystal. Breaking. By all means, Cowboy. Amuse us all with your expertise. She gestured grandly to the crowd, which had grown to include half the town. Windows opened along Main Street as shopkeepers and their wives pressed close to witness what promised to be either miracle or spectacular humiliation. Caspian ignored the snickers and whispers, his calloused fingers tracing the wagon's intricate metalwork with an almost reverent touch. This wasn't just any carriage, it was Austrian craftsmanship, probably worth more than his family's ranch had ever been. The kind of vehicle that spoke of European tours and finishing schools, of a world where $20 was pocket change. Problem's not as bad as it looks, he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. But Evangeline heard him, and her perfectly sculpted eyebrow arched in disbelief. Oh, really? Please, enlighten us with your vast mechanical knowledge. Duh! Crowd pressed closer as Caspian stood and walked to his horse. From his saddlebags, he withdrew a leather tool roll that had seen better decades. As he unrolled it, revealing an assortment of instruments that seemed almost surgical in their precision. A hush fell over the gathering. Daddy always said the right tool makes any job possible. Caspian murmured, selecting what looked like a modified wrench with unusual jointed segments. Of course, sometimes you gotta make your own tools. Evangeline's smirk faltered slightly. These weren't the crude implements she'd expected from a common ranch hand. Each tool showed the kind of meticulous care that spoke of true craftsmanship. Worn smooth by countless hours of use, but maintained with obvious pride, Caspian began to work. It dimmed. And within minutes, it became clear that something extraordinary was happening. His hands moved with the fluid confidence of a master, each motion deliberate and economical. The twisted brake mechanism began to straighten under his careful manipulation. The bent fittings responded to his touch as if he were coaxing them rather than forcing them. "That's impossible," breathed Marcus Finn. "That metal was cold-forged. Can't be bent back without heating it." But Caspian wasn't using brute force. Instead, he worked with leverage and pressure points, understanding the stress patterns in the metal with an intuition that went beyond mere skill. The crowd watched in growing amazement as the seemingly hopeless tangle of broken parts began to reassemble itself under his patient guidance. Evangeline's confidence wavered as she watched the cowboy work. This wasn't the fumbling attempt of an amateur trying to impress her. This was artistry in motion. Every movement spoke of deep knowledge, of understanding that went far beyond what any ordinary ranch hand should possess. "Where did you learn to work metal like that?" The question slipped out before she could stop herself. Caspian didn't look up from his work. "My father was a wheelwright back in Pennsylvania. German immigrant who could make steel sing if you knew how to listen." He selected another tool, this one curved in an impossible spiral. "Taught me that metal has memory. Hurt it, and it remembers. But treat it right." He applied gentle pressure to a crucial joint, and the entire assembly shifted back into perfect alignment. "It remembers that too." The axle slid home with a satisfying click that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Caspian stood, wiping his hands on a clean rag, and stepped back to examine his work. The wagon looked exactly as it had before the accident, pristine, elegant, and entirely functional. "Well," he said, touching his hat brim again, "that should get you where you're going, ma'am." Evangeline stared at the repaired wagon, her mouth slightly open. The transformation was so complete, so perfect, that for a moment she wondered if she'd imagined the entire breakdown. But the crowd's stunned faces confirmed what her eyes couldn't quite believe. She had just been thoroughly, expertly, and completely shown up by a man she'd dismissed as beneath her notice. The silence stretched like a held breath until someone in the crowd began to clap. Then another joined in, and another, until Main Street rang with applause and cheers. Men who'd struggled with the simplest repairs stood in awe of what they'd witnessed. Children pressed forward to touch the gleaming wheel as if it held some kind of magic. Evangeline stood frozen, her face cycling through emotions faster than weather in spring. Shock gave way to something that might have been respect, then quickly hardened into the defensive anger of someone whose worldview had just been shattered with surgical precision. "Lucky guess," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. She walked around the wagon, inspecting every detail of Caspian's work, searching desperately for some flaw she could seize upon. The repair was flawless. More than flawless, it was somehow better than the original, the metal flowing in lines that seemed more natural, more elegant than the Austrian craftsman had achieved. Caspian began rolling up his tools with the same careful attention he'd shown in using them. "Ma'am, I believe you made a bargain." His voice held no triumph. No mockery, just the quiet certainty of a man who'd done exactly what he'd promised to do. The crowd murmured agreement. "Fair's fair, Miss Hawthorne," called out Martha Stevens from the bakery. "You said if he fixed it, the wagon was his." Evangeline's jaw tightened. The wagon represented more than transportation. It was a symbol of her status, her superiority over these simple people. To hand it over to a dusty cowboy in front of half the town would be more than humiliation. It would be social suicide. "I said fix it properly," she replied, her voice regaining some of its earlier authority. "Any fool can make something look pretty. The real test is whether it holds up to use." She climbed into the driver's seat with practiced grace, her movements sharp with barely controlled fury. "If this contraption breaks down before I reach the county line, Our deal is off." She grabbed the reins and snapped them with unnecessary force. The horses, sensing her mood, stepped forward nervously. But the wagon moved smoothly, its wheels turning without so much as a whisper of complaint.
Ow.
The brake mechanism responded, perfectly to her touch. Even the suspension, which had been jarring and uncomfortable after months of rough roads, now provided a ride so smooth it felt like floating. Evangeline's expression grew darker with every perfect revolution of the wheels. She'd hoped, perhaps even expected, that the repair would prove inadequate under actual use. Instead, the wagon performed better than it had when she'd first taken delivery from the San Francisco dealer at the edge of town, where the road curved toward her father's ranch. She pulled the horses to a stop. Behind her, she could see the crowd still gathered on Main Street, watching and waiting. As PN stood apart from them, leaning against his horse with the patient stillness of a man accustomed to waiting for cattle to make up their minds. For a long moment, Evangeline sat motionless, her hands gripping the reins so tightly her knuckles showed white beneath her kid gloves. Everything in her upbringing, every lesson in superiority and entitlement that her father had drummed into her since childhood, screamed against what she was about to do. But underneath that conditioning, something else stirred. A part of her that remembered being 8 years old and watching her father's best craftsmen work. Fascinated by the transformation of raw materials into objects of beauty and function, part that had been slowly dying under layers of privilege and protection, awakening now at the touch of true mastery. She turned the wagon around. The crowd parted as she drove, back to where Caspian waited. She climbed down from the driver's seat with movements that seemed suddenly less certain, less armored in absolute confidence. "It appears," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "that you've held up your end of the bargain." She pulled leather document case from beneath the seat and extracted a thick sheaf of papers, the title and registration. As promised, Caspian accepted the papers without looking at them, his gray eyes never leaving her face. "Much obliged, ma'am." "Don't thank me yet," Evangeline said, and there was something almost like warning in her tone. "You've just made yourself the owner of the most expensive target in 3 counties. My father doesn't take kindly to being shown up, especially by—" She paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "By the help?" Caspian suggested mildly. A flush crept up Evangeline's neck. "I was going to say by anyone." The confrontation Evangeline had warned about came sooner than expected. 3 days after the wagon incident, Mordecai Hawthorne himself rode into Copper Creek with a dozen of his best hands, their spurs jangling like war bells as they dismounted in front of Murphy's General Store. The old man's face was carved from granite and twice as hard, his silver beard jutting forward like the prow of a battleship cutting through hostile waters. Caspian was inside, settling his account for supplies, when the batwing doors exploded inward. Conversations died as if someone had thrown a blanket over the entire store. Even the flies seemed to stop buzzing. "You this saddle tramp who thinks he can make a fool of my daughter?" Mordecai's voice filled the space like thunder in a canyon. Caspian turned slowly, a sack of flour balanced on his shoulder. "Don't recall making a fool of anyone, Mr. Hawthorne. Just fixed a broken wagon, same as I'd do for anybody, same as you'd do for anybody." Mordecai stepped forward, his riding boots striking the wooden floor like hammer blows. "You hear that, boys? This nobody thinks he's just anybody's handyman." Laughter rippled through his men, but it held no warmth. "Tell me, boy, what exactly do you think you're going to do with that wagon? Parade around town like some kind of gentleman? Haven't rightly decided yet? Might Caspian set the flour sack down with deliberate care? Might sell it? Might keep it. Depends on whether I find a use for something that fancy." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Mordecai's eyes, pale blue like winter ice, narrowed to slits. "See, that's where you're wrong. Dead wrong. 'Cause that wagon belongs to a Hawthorne, and Hawthornes don't make deals with drifters and saddle bums, especially not deals that make us look weak in front of the whole damn territory. Your daughter's word seemed good enough when she gave it." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. One of Hawthorne's men actually reached for his sidearm before the old man's raised hand stopped him. "My daughter," Mordecai said. his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than his earlier shouting, "is young and sometimes forgets her place. But I don't. And your place, boy, is whatever I say it is." He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch that clinked with the sound of gold coins. $500. More money than you'll see in 10 lifetimes of punching cattle. Take it and disappear. Today, Caspian looked at the pouch for a long moment. $500 was indeed more money than he'd ever seen in one place. It would buy him land of his own, maybe even enough cattle to start a real ranch, instead of hiring out his skills to other men's dreams. "That's generous," he said finally, "but I'll pass." The silence that followed was so complete that the sound of Mordecai's breathing seemed loud as a bellows. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority, the tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. "You misunderstand the nature of my offer. This isn't a negotiation. It's an ultimatum. Take the money and leave, or face the consequences of defying the Hawthorne family." Caspian picked up his supplies, balancing the flour sack on his shoulder again. "I understand just fine, Mr. Hawthorne, but your daughter made a deal, and she honored it. It's a Wagon's mine, fair and square, and I intend to keep it." He walked toward the door, the crowd parting before him like water. Mordecai's men tensed, hands hovering near their weapons, but their boss made no move to stop the cowboys. "Exit. You're making the biggest mistake of your life," Mordecai called after him. Caspian paused at the threshold and turned back. "Maybe, but it's my mistake to make." Outside, he loaded his supplies into the elegant wagon that now bore his name on the registration papers. The contrast was almost comical: sacks of beans and flour, coils of rope, and basic ranch supplies, in a conveyance designed for silk and champagne. But as he climbed onto the driver's seat, the wagon responded to his touch with the same perfect precision it had shown during the repair. As he drove out of town, Caspian caught sight of a familiar figure on horseback in the distance. Evangeline sat her mount like she'd been born in the saddle, watching from a hill overlooking Main Street. Even at that distance, he could feel the weight of her gaze, though whether it held anger, curiosity, or something else entirely, he couldn't say. What he didn't know was that Evangeline had been there for the entire confrontation, close enough to hear every word through the store's thin walls. And as she watched the dusty cowboy drive away in her former wagon, something twisted in her chest that felt suspiciously like admiration. That night, Evangeline Hawthorne did something she hadn't done since childhood. She snuck out of her father's house. The moonlight turned the rangeland silver as she rode her favorite mare along the creek path, following wheel tracks that were becoming as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. She'd been tracking Caspian's movements for a week now, telling herself it was simple curiosity about what he planned to do with her wagon. The truth was more complicated than she cared to admit. She found him camped in a grove of cottonwoods beside Willow Creek, the elegant wagon looking oddly at home among the rustling leaves and star-scattered sky. A small fire crackled nearby. Caspian sat beside it, working on something in his lap with the same focused intensity she'd witnessed during the repair. "You're going to wear a path in that leather if you keep rubbing it like that," she called. Out, stepping into the circle of firelight, Caspian looked up without surprise, as if he'd been expecting her visit. "Miss Hawthorne. Bit late for a social call, isn't it? Call me Evangeline." And I couldn't sleep. She dismounted and tied her horse to a nearby branch, her movements graceful despite the unconventional setting. "Kept thinking about what my father said to you today. Word travels fast in a small town." Word travels fast when half the town was pressed against Murphy's windows, listening to every word. She moved closer to the fire, and he could see that she'd traded her usual finery for practical riding clothes: dark trousers, simple blouse, and boots meant for stirrups rather than drawing rooms. The transformation was startling. Gone was the untouchable aristocrat. In her place stood a woman who looked like she belonged under the open sky. "What's that you're working on?" she asked, nodding toward his hands. Caspian held up a piece of leather harness, its surface gleaming with careful attention. "Bridle for my horse. The old one's about worn through." Evangeline stepped closer, drawn by the intricate pattern emerging under his skilled fingers. The leatherwork was as masterful as his metalworking had been, every stitch perfectly placed, every edge smooth to silk. But it was more than craftsmanship, it was art, with flowing designs that seemed to capture the very essence of wind in motion. "You didn't learn that from your wheelwright father?" she observed. "No, ma'am. That was from a Cheyenne medicine man who took pity on a lost kid about 15 years back. Taught me that everything you make should be beautiful, even the parts nobody else will see." He set the bridle aside and looked up at her, firelight dancing in his gray eyes. "Because you'll always know it's there." The simple philosophy hit Evangeline with unexpected force. In her world, beauty was something you displayed, something you wore or owned to impress others. The idea of creating beauty for its own sake, for the satisfaction of the creator alone, was as foreign to her as the surface of the moon. "Why didn't you take the money?" The question emerged before she could stop it. Caspian added another piece of wood to the fire, sparks swirling up toward the stars. "Your father's a powerful man, used to getting his way. But power doesn't make a man right, and it sure doesn't give him the right to break his daughter's word." "My word," Evangeline laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You don't understand. I've never given my word about anything that really mattered. Everything in my life has been decided for me: what to wear, where to go, who to associate with. That wagon was the first real decision I'd made in years, and I only made it because I was certain nobody could meet my challenge. But I did. Yes." She sat down across the fire from him, her composure finally beginning to crack. "You did. And suddenly I realized I'd given away the only thing that was truly mine to give. Not my father's, not bought with his money or influenced. By his power, mine." The confession hung between them like a bridge neither of them was quite ready to cross. Caspian studied her face in the flickering light, seeing past the surface beauty to something more complex underneath. Here was a woman who'd been given everything except the one thing that mattered most, the freedom to choose her own path. "Could have refused to honor the deal," he said quietly. "Nobody would have blamed you. Your father certainly expected you to. It's exactly why I couldn't." Evangeline's voice was fierce with sudden passion. "All my life, people have assumed I was just an ornament, a pretty accessory to the Hawthorne name. Weak, frivolous, incapable of standing behind my own words. When you fixed that wagon, you proved them all wrong about you. Honoring our deal was my chance to prove them wrong about me." The fire crackled between them, and in that sound, Caspian heard echoes of his own struggles. He'd spent his life being underestimated, dismissed as just another drifting cowhand. But where his response had been to prove his worth through skill, and integrity hers had been to armor herself in privilege and disdain. "What now?" he asked. Evangeline looked up at the stars, their distant light reflected in her dark eyes. "Now I figure out what comes after giving away the only thing that ever really belonged to me." The attack came at dawn, swift and merciless as a summer storm. Caspian woke to the thunder of hoofbeats and the sharp crack of rifle fire splintering the morning air. Through the cottonwood leaves he caught glimpses of riders circling his camp like wolves around wounded prey. 6 men in Hawthorne colors, their faces masked by bandanas, their intent crystal clear. He rolled behind the wagon as bullets chewed bark from the trees above his head. The elegant vehicle that had started this whole affair now provided the only cover between him and a very permanent solution to Mordecai Hawthorne's problem. "Come out, saddle tramp." One of the riders shouted, "Make this easy on yourself." Caspian checked his rifle, a well-maintained Winchester that had seen him through. More trouble than he cared to remember. 6 rounds in the magazine, 1 in the chamber. 7 shots against 6 men who probably had orders to make his death. Looked like the result of a robbery gone wrong. The mathematics weren't encouraging. That's when he heard another sound cutting. Through the gunfire, a single horse running hard, its rider low in the saddle and coming fast. One of the attackers wheeled his mount to face this new threat. Raising his rifle with confident precision, the shot never came. Evangeline. Hawthorne burst from the creekside brush like an avenging angel, her horse's hooves throwing up clods of earth as she charged straight at the gunman. The last second, she swung low in her saddle. A riding trick she'd learned from watching Comanche warriors at a Wild West show, and struck the man with her shoulder. He tumbled from his horse with a startled cry his rifle spinning away into the underbrush. "Evangeline, get down!" Caspian's voice cracked with sudden fear, not for himself, but for the woman who'd just thrown herself into the middle of a gunfight to save a man she barely knew. But Evangeline wasn't finished. She wheeled her mount in a tight circle, her own rifle, a custom piece that had been her grandfather's, appearing in her hands with practiced ease. The remaining attackers hesitated, clearly not expecting to face Mordecai Hawthorne's own daughter in armed combat. That hesitation cost them dearly. Caspian rose from behind the wagon, his Winchester speaking with steady authority. 2 shots. 2 men down, not killed, but wounded badly enough to take them out of the fight. Evangeline's rifle added its voice to the symphony of violence. Her shots precise and devastating. In less than 3 minutes, it was over. 4 men wounded or unconscious, 1 fleeing back toward the Hawthorne ranch, and 1 the apparent leader trapped between 2 very angry and very capable shooters. "Take off that bandana," Evangeline commanded, her voice carrying in authority. That would have made her father proud. Let's see who Mordecai Hawthorne sends to murder men in their sleep. The revealed face belonged to Jake Morrison, Hawthorne's foreman, and the closest thing to a son the old man had ever acknowledged. His expression was equal parts pain and disbelief as he stared at his employer's daughter.
"Ah!"
Miss Evangeline gasped, blood seeping from a shoulder wound. "You don't understand. My father sent you to kill an innocent man rather than admit his daughter had been bested in a fair challenge." Evangeline's rifle never wavered. "I understand. Perfectly." Caspian moved to secure the other wounded men, his movements efficient and professional. But his eyes kept returning to Evangeline, taking in the transformation that seemed to grow more complete with each passing moment. This wasn't the pampered society belle who'd mocked him in town. This was a warrior, as fierce and capable as any man he'd ever fought beside. "You realize what this means," Morrison said, his voice heavy with something that might have been pity. "You've chosen your side. Your father won't forgive this. Ever." Evangeline dismounted, her boots hitting the ground with solid determination. "Then I suppose it's a good thing I never asked for his forgiveness." She looked at Caspian, and he saw in her eyes the same quiet resolve he'd felt when he'd first decided to honor their bargain. "But I might ask for yours." "Mine? For bringing this trouble down on you? For not seeing sooner what kind of man my father really is?" She gestured toward the wounded men, toward the bullet-scarred trees, toward the evidence of violence that had shattered the peaceful morning. "For taking 26 years to find the courage to stand up for what's right." Caspian walked over to where she stood, his rifle held loose in his hands. Up close, he could see the slight tremor in her fingers. The aftermath of adrenaline and the weight of what she'd just done. She'd saved his life, but in doing so, she'd burned every bridge that connected her to her old existence. "Nothing to forgive," he said simply. "You honored your word. That's all any person can do." In the distance, they could hear more riders, approaching, probably a larger force sent to finish what Morrison's team had started. But for this moment, in the golden light of a morning that had almost been his last, Caspian found himself looking at Evangeline Hawthorne and seeing not the enemy's daughter, but something far more dangerous to his carefully guarded heart. He was seeing home. 6 months later, the wedding of Caspian Wilde and Evangeline Hawthorne became the most talked-about event in 3 territories, though not for the reasons anyone expected. It wasn't held in the grand cathedral that Mordecai Hawthorne had built for his daughter's eventual society marriage. Instead, the ceremony took place in a grove of cottonwoods beside Willow Creek, officiated by a circuit preacher who'd known Caspian since he was a boy working his father's forge. The bride didn't wear imported French silk or family pearls worth more than most ranches. She wore a dress of simple white cotton that she'd sewn herself. Her only adornment, a silver necklace that Caspian had crafted from a broken bridle bit transformed through his skilled hands into something beautiful. The guest list was equally unconventional. No railroad barons or territorial governors graced the makeshift altar. Instead, the gathering consisted of cowboys and shopkeepers, farmers, and their wives. Children who'd watched in wonder as Caspian had transformed broken things into objects of beauty. People who measured worth not by the size of a man's bank account, but by the strength of his character and the skill of his hands. Mordecai Hawthorne was notably absent. Though his influence lingered like smoke from a distant fire, he disowned Evangeline publicly, striking her name from his will and forbidding any of his employees from acknowledging her existence. The great Hawthorne Ranch, which she'd been raised to inherit, would pass to distant cousins who'd never set foot in the territory. If the loss grieved her, Evangeline showed no sign of it as she spoke her vows in the golden light of early autumn. Her voice was clear and strong, carrying across the gathered crowd with the same authority that had once commanded respect in society ballrooms. "I promise to stand beside you," she said, her eyes never leaving Caspian's weathered face, "not because you can provide for me, but because you've shown me what it means to create something lasting with your own two hands. I promise to be your partner in building whatever comes next, whether it's repairing wagons or raising cattle, or simply making a life that's worthy of the love we found." Caspian's own vows were shorter, but no less profound. "Promise to see you for who you really are," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "not who the world expects you to be. I promise to trust your strength as much as you trust mine, and to never forget that the finest things in life are the ones we build together." When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared tasted of freedom and possibility, of two people who'd found in each other not just love, but the courage to become who they were always meant to be. The reception was held in the yard behind Murphy's General Store, with tables made from sawhorses and planks, food brought by every family in attendance, and music provided by Old Pete's surprisingly sweet fiddle and Martha Stevens' grandson on harmonica. It was chaotic and loud and completely perfect. As the evening wore on and the stars began to emerge, Caspian and Evangeline slipped away from the celebration to stand beside their wagon, the same elegant vehicle that had brought them together through conflict and defiance. It had been modified over the months, its pristine interior now fitted with practical storage for the tools of their trade. They'd started a business together, using Caspian's skills and Evangeline's business acumen to serve ranchers and townspeople throughout the territory. "Any regrets?" Caspian asked, his arm around his wife's waist as they looked up at the vast expanse of stars. Evangeline considered the question seriously. She considered everything these days. The life she'd left behind had included luxury and status, security and social position. The life she'd chosen offered hard work and uncertainty, the constant challenge of building something from nothing. "Only one," she said finally, and Caspian tensed beside her. Then she smiled, the expression transforming her face with mischievous joy. "I regret that it took me so long to realize that the most valuable things in life can't be bought with money. They have to be earned through courage and commitment and the willingness to risk everything for what really matters." She turned in his arms, her face upturned to catch the starlight. "I love you," Caspian wailed. "Not because you fixed my wagon, but because you showed me how to fix myself." Their kiss was witnessed only by the stars and the gentle sound of Willow Creek flowing past, carrying with it the promise of new beginnings and the certainty that some love stories are worth fighting for, no matter the cost. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of their wedding celebration continuing, the laughter and music of people who'd learned that true wealth couldn't be measured in gold or land, but in the bonds of community and the courage to stand up for each other when it mattered most. And if Mordecai Hawthorne, alone in his grand house, heard those sounds carried on the evening wind and felt a moment's regret for the daughter he'd lost to his own pride, well, that was a story for another day. For now, there was only this: two people who'd found in each other the missing pieces of themselves, standing together under an endless sky, ready to build whatever came next with their own four hands, and the unshakable certainty that they were exactly where they belonged.